Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today for our weekly news analysis show is my co-host, attorney and Republican strategist Jay Carson. We start this week with some important developments in healthcare policy. Now, late last week, President Trump announced that his administration would be cutting off cost-sharing subsidies to insurers, which reimburse them for lowering deductibles and copays for people from 100 to 250% of the poverty level who are enrolled in the Obamacare markets. Now, the subsidies are required by the Affordable Care Act, but the money for them was never actually appropriated, which led to still pending lawsuits by congressional Republicans. Now, in the interim, the Obama administration and until now the Trump administration have kept making these payments out of concern for the disruption to the exchanges if those payments stopped. And for a while earlier this week, it looked like there might be a legislative fix to this when Senate Health Committee Chair Lamar Alexander and Ranking Democratic member Patty Murray said they'd come to an agreement on a plan to fund the subsidies for 2 years, as well as to give states more flexibility by making it easier for them to get waivers to certain Obamacare provisions. And the measure they come up with would also restore millions of dollars in funding for exchange sign-up efforts, which the Trump administration recently cut. And this proposed legislation, it has a lot of support, really, doctors, hospitals, insurers, and including groups like the National Governors Association and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And initially, it seemed like President Trump was one of the supporters, but later in the week, he backed away from it, characterizing the plan as a bailout for insurers. So that's kind of where we are now on this. So Jay, I guess I'm wondering a couple things. Will this become law, do you think, in some form? And maybe even more importantly, should it?
Well, gosh, I think the conservative position, and first, my first, thought when the Alexander Murray proposal, as it's being called, was floated was, wow, this really worked. Donald Trump is, I don't want to use the word genius, but this worked. Now this is the Constitution working the way it ought to. The president saying, look, these payments were put in place without appropriate legislative authority. The court has thus far ruled that it is unconstitutional. I think it's unconstitutional. I'm going to stop it and put it back onto Congress to do what it's supposed to do. And which Congress picked up the ball and seemed to be moving the right direction. And I would have then expected Donald Trump to say something like, see, it works. This is the way the Constitution is supposed to work, separation of powers. But he didn't. Now, I guess then the bigger question is does it really matter? And I think my sense to that is probably not, because I think there is going to be enough momentum to get something done legislatively. And there's going to be some back and forths, and everyone's going to have to take something that they don't like. Republicans are going to have to swallow what are essentially payouts to insurers, but what they get back from that is maybe the some of this more flexibility that Trump was doing by executive order written into statute. What they also get is the stability that these exchanges aren't going to collapse in the near term. And that kind of gets them off the hook from Obamacare being held responsible for an Obamacare death spiral. So, all in all, I mean, I'd say kudos to Congress for picking this up, and this is maybe where the thing should have started, as opposed to trying to do the bigger repeal and replace.
Well, I think there, it's an example of on some issues when there really is broad support for getting something done. Like I said, it's not the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is no, pinko liberal lefty group, right? And that they still hold some sway with a lot of Republicans in Congress. And when you have a situation where the failure to act could result in some pretty serious consequences, it's nice to think that Congress actually can do something. It's disappointing to me that the president didn't do the sort of thing that you would have hoped he would have done, and I would have hoped he would have done. But I also get the sense that President Trump kind of wants to be on both sides of this issue. So no matter what happens, he can claim victory, essentially, because to him, that seems
I think he wants to be able to argue maybe for a little bit more. Although, uh, again, to me, the idea that instead of arguing against the insurance subsidy payments, what he ought to do is just insist that there be a higher Republican price for that, or a higher Democrat price, depending on which way you look. Meaning, yes, I'd be okay getting behind these subsidies now that they're done in a constitutional appropriate manner through Congress. But I also want to see this other flexibility in the bill. I want to see the ability to create high risk pools across state lines, those sort of things, and maybe that's what he's setting up for. But to me, I mean, I almost think a little bit that Trump is sort of out of this conversation at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know what you mean. And I think also it's interesting to see how, well, before I get to what the states are doing, the states are doing kind of an interesting thing to adjust to this landscape. But I also think that President Trump, I think he's right in the sense, and this is something I wanted to mention earlier on. I think he's right that it's unconstitutional. Though I don't know that he actually came up with that all on his own. But
well, no, I mean
But you and I have talked about that, and we both, I think, agree that those payments, that's a sketchy sort of thing, and really the appropriate thing is for Congress to act. But more than that, this is, like you said, how the process is supposed to work, that each side takes a little bit of something that it doesn't necessarily want to take on here. But I should also point out that, you characterize this as payouts or bailouts or something that the president did, at least, to insurance companies. Now, just to be clear, right, under Obamacare, the insurers were told, you will have to subsidize these people, but we will pay you back for those subsidies. So it's not like it's this massive giveaway to insurers.
Sure,
the insurers,
no, and I think that's right. I mean, I should say that they're really just, it's almost a Fifth Amendment kind of question, isn't it? I mean, the government compelled them to essentially add on extra costs. And they're just seeking that they be compensated for those costs.
Exactly, because they obviously use that in determining the rates they would set and that sort of thing. And speaking of rates, it's really interesting what some of the states are doing to sort of work around President Trump cutting off these payments, and the possibility that maybe there won't be any legislation. And I'm not maybe as optimistic about it as you are, actually. So to kind of explain this, you have to understand there are two types of credits in Obamacare. There are the tax credits based on income level, and those are pegged to the cost of the Obamacare Silver plan. That's like the third highest one. You have gold and platinum there. And then there are also the cost-sharing subsidies, and that's what President Trump recently stopped. Now, the tax credits are still in effect. And what almost all the states have done, I think 40 plus states, through their state insurance regulators, is they have allowed insurers to jack up the price of their silver plans. So the resulting increases in tax credits will essentially offset the losses from the Trump administration ending the subsidy payments. And because the amount consumers pay can only go up to a certain percentage of their income, again, it's based on this silver plan, that means that consumers won't actually pay more. It's just a way to get more money from the government to make up for the loss of the cost sharing money. And that's all being done through the state insurance regulators in, like I said, the vast majority of the states, which is a really sort of clever workaround, I think, for this.
I think so too, and I applaud the states and their ingenuity for doing that. So,
but of course, the first thing that occurred to me is, wow, that's really clever. But the second thing that occurred to me is, isn't it sad that we have a system that is set up like this, where you have to do these weird little kludges and things like that? This clearly is not how it should be working in a more ideal world.
Yes and no. And I would make, this is sort of more like a meta conservative Republican, small R Republican argument that, for so long we've set up this system where so much state and local funding comes through the federal government, which is a bizarre sort of situation. I mean, you pay your taxes to the federal government, then they sort of divvy it up and send it back to states and localities. The results are the states and localities can sort of get away with lower taxes and providing more services, and then you can complain about your federal taxes. The downside to this is it sort of makes client states out of these state and local governments, which I don't think is something that's particularly healthy. And some of the tax reform proposals that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, for example, the state and local tax write-off would sort of alter that. Would have to make states and localities be maybe a little more honest. But that's just sort of the bigger meta view. But I think that's how we're in this weird situation, is that the money sort of has this weird, goes to Washington, then comes back and goes back and forth a couple times in some cases.
Yeah, it can lead to some bizarre sort of workarounds and things like that for sure. Before we get to our next story, we'd like to thank our first sponsor for today, and that's Blue Bottle Coffee. I love coffee. Just as an experiment a while back, I tried tea. I even tried a while back herbal tea and even water. I mean, that's pretty radical to start off my day. But I keep on, I don't know what I'm thinking about, especially herbal tea. But anyway, I keep on coming back to coffee. And, not just any coffee. My mom drinks this pre-ground stuff that comes in big, I don't know, canisters. I can't drink that stuff. And, honestly, I don't care much for Starbucks either. It just tastes kind of, I don't know, just sad to me, I guess, and burnt. And I just basically, I can't settle for anything less than what I think is the highest quality coffee, because I at least can really taste the difference. And so when I say that Blue Bottle Coffee is really great coffee, I say it as somebody with incredibly high coffee standards. It's roasted just days before it gets to you, which is really important because that means that it's a peak of freshness, and that's a huge thing. And Jay, I know you've tried Blue Bottle Coffee too, right?
I do. I like it a lot. And to me, it's something that Blue Bottle Coffee, you really get the flavors of the coffee. And I don't mean that in terms of it's like flavored coffee, but there are hints, and there are it's a different experience. And I think sometimes, other coffees you just get this overwhelming, as you said, almost burnt kind of taste, but there's a lot of subtleties that come out in this that I think if you're a real coffee lover, you'll appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have something for everyone. You might like dark roast, you might like light roast, high acidity, low acidity, whatever. They have you covered, basically. And another big plus for me, it has to do with sustainability. Blue Bottle works directly with farmers all over the world to source the most delicious and sustainable coffee they can find. Big deal for me. And right now, Blue Bottle has a great deal for Politics Guys listeners. Sign up for a free trial of fresh, delicious, I can say that word, Blue Bottle Coffee at bluebottlecoffee.com/TPG. I mean, what do you have to lose? It's a free trial. That's bluebottlecoffee.com/TPG. bluebottlecoffee.com/TPG. All right, moving on to our next story. Late this week, the Senate passed a budget resolution for fiscal year 2018. And on the surface, that seems extremely weird because fiscal year 2018 began weeks ago at the beginning of October. Now, here's the deal. In theory, both chambers are supposed to pass yearly budget resolutions really sometime around April. And these resolutions are designed to set out a basic blueprint and give instructions to the committees that write the actual legislation that needs to be signed by the president and then becomes the budget for the next fiscal year.
And we should highlight that the budget resolutions aren't the actual appropriations.
Exactly.
They're the blueprint for the actual appropriations.
Exactly. They're not the law. Right. Absolutely. And so, but in reality, what's happened here is that the budget resolution has become nearly meaningless with one exception. And that one exception is that Senate budget resolutions can include instructions to committees that direct them to take action that will raise or lower the deficit. Though if the instruction is to raise it, it can't extend longer than a decade under the so-called Byrd Rule, which is named for longtime West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd. Now, the reason this matters... What's that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to mention that.
It never gets mentioned.
That's true. But anyway, the reason this matters is that these budget resolution instructions can't be filibustered in the Senate meaning that instead of 60 votes, the majority party needs only 51 or 50 votes if they have the vice president who can vote to break ties on their side. Should also mention that another important wrinkle here is that the budget resolution itself can't be filibustered, though the minority party is allowed to offer a number of amendments to it, which they always do, and it's kind of political theater. They call it the votorama, and the minority uses this essentially as a way to make the majority party vote against things that will look bad in campaign commercials, essentially. So that's kind of how the situation has played out, and this all played out on Thursday. The Senate voted 51-49 to approve the 2018 budget resolution, with only one Republican opposing it. That's Kentucky's Rand Paul, and he believed that essentially we have unsustainable federal fund spending, and so he just was foursquare against this. Now, the key line in this almost entirely pointless 93-page document. In fact, a number of the Republican senators said, this is a pointless thing, except for this one thing. An instruction to two congressional committees that deal with tax-related matters to come up with changes that will increase the deficit, that's right, increase it, by not more than $1.5 trillion over a decade. So, Jay, I'm betting you know why this particular instruction is so crucial, right?
Right. It's crucial because what it does is it ties to the tax reform plan that passed the House.
Exactly.
And it would enable this to go back to the House and let the House pass the Senate, the Senate changed version, which means that the country would get tax reform and it could be had by a simple majority with the Senate.
Exactly. So the whole exercise,
which is as Joe Biden once said, in regard to other legislation, is a big effing deal. So
yeah, absolutely. But you think about how crazy this is, right? This process, which was set up, this budget resolution process, which was set up in the mid-70s, was designed totally not for policy. It was not supposed to be about policy, but really since the early 90s, that's what it has become, a way for slim majorities in the Senate to pass things without having to deal with the filibuster, basically, and this is no way to legislate. I don't think I would actually rather see the Senate just do away with the filibuster altogether, because I think that would actually lead to better legislative outcomes, because under these budget resolutions, there are certain things that can't go in and can go in. You have that 10-year timeline where things can't increase the deficit after 10 years. And so it really does not make for great legislation. That's one of the reasons why certain aspects of Obamacare are problematic, because once they lost their 60th senator when Ted Kennedy died and Scott Brown got that seat, they had to pass some changes. They had to do
it by reconciliation.
Exactly. And that left them with a lot less. And so this is a bad way to make laws. And I would, because this is not going away, I think a far better approach would just be to just blow up the filibuster and say, we're not going to do this kind of workaround system. If we're going to govern by just bare majority in the Senate, fine, let's do that. But let's not hamstring the process. At least that's my take. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a certain honesty in that approach. And I wouldn't. I think a lot of conservatives would come to that same conclusion, and I think maybe we'll get there eventually. But and I think the other thing we should point out is all of these things that we're talking about, the filibuster and the reconciliation rule and all this, none of it has anything to do with the Constitution. These are all internal rules created by Congress, so they can unmake them as they see fit. And there's I think there's something to be said for making the process less Byzantine. In terms of having all these sort of game playing and so forth. But this is sort of the patchwork kind of system we've arrived at. And maybe it might be good at some point to have some sort of, commission, a bipartisan, bicameral commission on legislative rules, and, look through and say, do we rewrite the House and Senate rules? Now, to some extent, this is typically done by each house every time there's a takeover. They take a look and there's tweaks and so forth. But I don't know. Maybe it's time for that. Maybe not. But it's also impossible to erase, people seeking partisan advantage from that process. And yeah, I don't know, nor should you. I mean, I think you deal with it as it is. And look, this is a political process. So I don't know. I think we could see the end of the filibuster in the next couple years, depending on what happens. But it's kind of been chipped away bit by bit. So we'll see.
Well, let me ask you about a related issue to this. You mentioned these internal processes, and they're oftentimes sort of Byzantine. There's another process that sort of has come up, and that's this tradition. I guess you call it the Senate tradition of what are called blue slips for federal judges. And
blue slips, that hit the news a week or two ago.
Yeah, I wanted to get your take on this because it's been in the news. And let me just really quickly, Mitch McConnell, who's of course the Senate Majority Leader, is in favor of doing away with blue slips. And to understand what that means, Jay, you're the one with our.
We should explain what a blue slip is,
exactly. So why don't you go ahead and explain it to everyone?
Completely different than a blue dress. No, a blue slip is a traditional manner in which, if there's an appointment from a certain state, the senators from that state would have the opportunity to submit what was called a blue slip, because it was a blue piece of paper. It would essentially blackball that nominee. The intent was originally to sort of protect, I guess, the nation from say you've got an appointee coming from a certain state, and maybe the senator in that state knows a little bit more about that appointee than, say, the president or the appointing body, and can sort of say, oh, hold on here. I think you need to take another look at this person. And when I say knew something about, I mean in terms of ethical problems, issues like that. It's since the, I would say probably late 80s, early 90s, though, has become more of a partisan political piece to block nominees. And that's sort of what has coming up here is Senate Democrats seeking to blue slip not to block Trump judicial nominees.
Yeah, and I actually, this certainly, I'm not crazy about hardly any of Donald Trump's judicial nominees. It comes as no surprise, but I agree with Senator McConnell here and the president, who also believes in doing away with this, because I think that other things being equal, the president deserves to, unless there are some, ethical or other issues, the president deserves to have his people approved, unless there's a reason that they're unqualified or something. And, that works out really well for me when someone in my party is president, but not so much when other parties. But I think the underlying idea that the president, that the Senate has advise and consent on this, but that doesn't mean, well, I don't like your politics, so I'm not going to approve. It means that, you might not be qualified. At least that's my take on advising, what the advice and consent of the Senate means. And I think, I would guess you probably agree with that. Yeah.
I would. Yeah, I do agree with that. And the blue slips are sort of a piece with what was sort of a bygone era. If you think about it, where there was this sense that, again, this was, there was a time, and I don't want to overstate this, because I'm not one of these people who looks back and say, oh man, the good old days, nothing was partisan then, everybody got along, because that wasn't the case. But for these lower court nominations, there was a time, I think, where it was like, look, is this guy qualified? Yeah. Or this woman qualified? And the sense wasn't, what's their politics, what's their, they're not being grilled on whether they're a true Catholic or not, which happened in a Senate Judiciary hearing a couple weeks ago. It was is this someone who has the temperament, demeanor, ethical compass to serve in that position? And it was sort of a gentleman's world sort of thing, where it's like, well, if this guy says he's probably not, okay, well, then maybe he's not. And it also arose in a period. And you're talking about, going back quite a while with blue slips, where there wasn't a news media that was 24/7 investigating, for lack of a better word, every every nominee. I mean, this information wasn't readily available, and you sort of look to someone in that state, and you would say, "Hey, is this person okay or not okay?" And the idea was that blue slips would be used rarely, and only in that case of hey, this is really not okay.
Yeah. Well, it's
just because the rest of the process was going to be fairly, rubber stampy.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with the filibuster. I think these are that's why I wanted to bring this up, because they seem to be, two things that made sense when they were in a different Senate, in a different environment, when they were used rarely and judiciously, but we just don't see that anymore. So, all right, well, let's move on. One of the first things that Donald Trump did after he took office was to put in place a temporary travel ban that targeted 6 predominantly Muslim countries. And that was a ban that was blocked by multiple federal judges. Then the Trump team went back to the drawing board, came up with a revised temporary travel ban, which was again blocked by multiple federal judges. Now, most recently, the administration came back with a permanent travel ban targeting mostly Muslim countries, but throwing in North Korea and some citizens in Venezuela. Well, this week, travel ban 3.0 met the same fate, blocked by multiple federal judges. In this case, is district court judges in Hawaii and Maryland, both of whom blocked the previous ban. So on this, Jay, I guess I've got...
You're leaving out a step.
Okay, go ahead.
And that is that it did go to the Supreme Court on the injunction question, meaning can this law be blocked right now immediately? And the Supreme Court said no, it cannot, with the exception of the certain people who had legitimate relationships with others in the United States, and then that went back to the lower courts to get kicked around and then back up. And importantly, and I just want to kind of crow about this because I didn't mention it last week, but as I predicted, as for the arguments that were scheduled on the second travel ban, the Supreme Court has kicked it and dismissed the case as moot. So that
because now we have the permanent one,
like
the 9. Yeah. So
right. So now we have a new one, but my sense is that the arguments that are being made by the I don't say arguments, the decisions of the district court judges are very much of a piece and pretty much the same rationale that they used in trying to strike down the other travel bans, in that they look to what President Trump said during the campaign, and they say this must be a Muslim ban, and then therefore is an attempt to impose a religious test on entering and so forth. But
yeah, and
but go ahead. I want to get your thoughts on this, because I've sort of talked at length that I just don't think the Supreme Court's going to go there, and I still don't think they're going to go there.
Yeah, I'm conflicted on this. I read so in the Hawaii judge, and I do not recall his name. I think Judge Watson, I believe. He wrote in part that the administration had failed to show a clear link between a person's nationality and the threat he or she posed. And I thought about that, and that to me seems like a reasonable point. And the second thing he points out is that, people who might pose a danger but aren't in one of these countries could fall outside the scope of the ban. And he wrote, this leads to absurd results, that the order is actually simultaneously overbroad and under-inclusive. And I thought, that makes a lot of sense to me too. And so here's why I'm conflicted, Jay. I'm conflicted because I think that both of these judges make very good points, putting the whole religious test thing aside. Okay, putting all that aside, I think
right. We're talking just straight out sort of rational basis sort of review.
Exactly. So I think they make a good case, but I have to weigh that against the fact that, in these instances, I have a strong belief that when we're talking about national security stuff, and we're not talking about U.S. citizens, that the benefit of the doubt has to strongly go to the president of the United States, whoever that happens to be. And so I think the judges make a good case, but I don't think it's quite good enough. And I hate the travel ban as a matter of policy. I agree with the judges that it's bad policy, but I can't quite bring myself to say it's unconstitutional. We've talked about this again and again and again, that there are plenty
it's the Scalia stamp that he wish he had, that's stupid but constitutional.
Exactly. And I think this just passes under there. And so I know I'll probably get some blowback from some people who say, I can't believe you're siding with Trump. And I'm not siding with Trump here. I'm sort of trying to side with what I think is...
You're siding with the Constitution.
Exactly. I'm sliding with the Constitution, wrapping myself in the flag as we speak. But no, I mean, and I think that's a really important distinction to make. So while I agree with the reasoning of these...
I'll sort of, I mean, I got your back on this a little bit, because I want to, to me, I think it's a little bit, the district judges who've made these decisions, and to some extent, they kind of get themselves hemmed in a little bit. And they didn't have, in fairness to them also, a whole lot of guidance from the Supreme Court, in that the Supreme Court's striking down the injunction was sort of summary, and didn't give a whole lot of reason, but it did cite to that great deference type reasoning that you're talking about. And I think, when you look at this, first of all, in making rules, the executive branch is always afforded significant deference. That's sort of the starting point. It's even a little bit more deferential than when you get into national security. And I think that's what this is going to come down to. And I think the courts really ought not to. And I think the Supreme Court's this is why they're going to uphold what President Trump has done, do not want to be in the business of policy making in national security. And again, you could make the argument certainly that the Trump ban is a dumb idea, that it's unnecessary. To say it has no rational relationship whatsoever to the ends that he's trying to accomplish, though, I don't think he can get there.
Yeah, I think the administration made enough of a case that this was based on a thorough review. No, I don't, like I said, I don't buy the logic. I wouldn't have done the same thing in that position. But right. I think,
and again, in the third iteration of this, second and third, the administration went back and did what it should have done in the first one, and sort of, made some findings of fact and supported this with here's our reasons for doing so.
Yeah. And, we should step back even one more step. And this is something that, even though, ideologically we disagree on a lot, we both have a certain discomfort with the courts making these decisions, because we tend to believe in actually the idea of democracy, where, the democratically elected branches should have a little more say than the undemocratic branch. And as a general principle, you and I both agree on that.
No, the only I would say the weakness that I would see if I were arguing against the Trump travel ban from a legal perspective is that this is different in that it is a permanent ban rather than a temporary ban. And the argument would go something that this is a permanent change in immigration policy, and therefore is something that ought to go through Congress rather than the presidency or through the executive branch. But I don't know how far you get on that argument, because I think the deference to deal with national security matters still is going to trump that.
Yeah, I would expect that, like you, that the Supreme Court is going to eventually uphold this. I would expect it to be a 5-4 decision, and so we'll see. But I think we're going to be proven right on this one.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say it will be more than a 5-4 decision.
Wow.
I will say it'll be perhaps 7-2.
Going to go 7-2.
I'll say it's going to be 6-3.
All right. Well, we'll see. Definitely. All right. Well, this week, Democratic Senators Amy Klobuchar, Mark Warner, and Republican John McCain introduced something called the Honest Ads Act. And this was in response to concerns over Russian-sponsored ads on social media that were intended to influence the outcome of the 2016 elections. Everyone's aware of that. Now, this measure
Well, we'll get into that.
No,
Yeah.
well, okay, but sure. Okay, hold on 1 minute. We'll see. Anyway, this would target all digital platforms with an average of at least 50 million visitors per month. So you and I, the politics guys, just under the wire there.
We would just get under the radar.
Just barely. Yeah. But it would require the companies to maintain a public file of all electioneering communications that were purchased by a person or group that spends more than $500 total on ads on that platform. That file would have a digital copy of the ad, a description of the audience the advertisement targets, the number of views generated, the dates and times of publication, the rates charged, and the contact information of the purchaser. Now, it would also require online platforms to make all reasonable efforts to ensure that foreign individuals and foreign entities aren't purchasing political advertisements in order to influence the American electorate, which is already illegal. And bipartisan companion legislation to this was also introduced in the House. Now, I think it's important to note that back in 2006, the Federal Elections Commission, the FEC, decided to exempt online platforms from the same campaign ad reporting laws that all other media are held to, in the belief that the internet should be maintained as this innovative and open forum for political discourse. Though, that was, of course, back before smartphones, the explosion of social media, fake news, and well-documented efforts by a hostile foreign government to use social media advertising to spread fake news and influence U.S. elections. So you can kind of see where I'm headed on this. But Jay, I wonder what you think. Do you see this as a reasonable legislative response to a very different technological environment, or do you see it as a case of overreach by two liberals and one conservative who's been, I would say, the biggest Republican supporter?
Conservative?
Well, okay.
two liberals
right.
and, well, John
one
McCain,
Republican who's been unquestionably the biggest Republican supporter of limits on paid political speech in at least the last several decades. I mean, that 2002 law, that was the McCain-Feingold Act, right? So what do you think?
Well, I'm coming at this a couple different ways. The sense I get is this Congress is sort of scrambling, like we've got to do something. So they will do something. Will it actually make any difference with any of this? No, I don't think so. I think it'll be an added burden on these tech companies. Can they shoulder the burden? Probably. But I'm not. I don't know. I guess the best way to phrase is ambivalent. On the one hand, I'm always a little concerned to see any sort of movement to curtail political speech. That said, I mean, does this really do that? Well, not a lot. It really just sort of imposes some of the basic attribution rules that were already in place on other types of media. So is this, am I saying is this a threat to the First Amendment? No, I don't think it is. Is it the camel's nose under the tent? Well, you never can tell. But the more important piece of this to me is it's just one of these things that strikes me as sort of pointless. If you look at the Russian ads, and again, now we're finding out what they were, Mike, none of these ads were direct campaigning, electioneering that would have fallen under the FEC regulations. So what I'm saying is none of these were ads that said vote for Donald Trump, vote against Hillary Clinton. Or rather, they were just trying to like, for lack of a better word, stir up trouble. The other thing that's significant about the Russian Facebook ads, 50% of them ran after the election. So if you were doing ad buys for an election and 50% of them ran afterward, I'd say you're not doing a very good job. Yeah. So my point is, these ads wouldn't even what the Russians did wouldn't be covered by what this bill proposes. Now, would it prevent some other direct meddling by other groups? Maybe. Are there some easy workarounds that way? Yes, I think there are. So, Again, I guess my best response, and this isn't, I suppose, great for a show we're supposed to discuss controversial stuff, is ambivalent, is meh.
Yeah. Well, I in a way I would say I'm strongly supportive of half of it. And I think so yeah, exactly. Well, let me explain. So I really like,
And I'm half supportive, but not strongly.
Exactly. So, I don't know exactly how we agree on that, but I like the second part, that idea of all reasonable efforts must be made by these companies to ensure that foreign individuals and entities aren't purchasing ads. I think that's pretty important. They shouldn't be in the first place. I wonder though how difficult or how easy it would be for foreign governments to subvert this by using third parties in the U.S., that kind of thing.
It would be really, 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 really easy.
This is what I'm thinking, but I don't necessarily object to the first part, all of those, that public thing with all of that information that would be required, but I don't know that it would do much good except in after the fact analyses. I guess it'd give us more data to work with, because what I think one thing we've learned is that transparency isn't nearly the panacea that proponents make it out to be. We already have these massive databases on political spending and so forth, and they really haven't, to my mind, changed much of anything. And so I think this would be not very useful, and it certainly would impose a burden on these companies. Yeah, they could afford it, certainly, but what would be the good of it? I don't know that there would be much good. And in the end, when I think about these things, I feel like this is kind of the price we pay for living in an open society. And when that open society starts to lose the capacity to critically and rationally analyze political claims, then we're in big trouble. And I don't think that's trouble that can be solved by legislating it away. The problem isn't that the Russians are buying ads. The problem is that people can't separate fake news from real news and can't investigate claims. To me, that's the bigger problem. That's not a legislative problem. That's an educational problem.
Wow. I couldn't have said it better myself.
There you go. So I thought
that was impressive.
I thought you'd agree with that. So, I don't know if this is going to go anywhere. There's obviously a lot of concern about the Russians making attempts to influence our elections, but I just don't know if it's going to go anywhere. And even if it does, I don't think it's going to be very helpful at all.
Yeah, no, I think we're all on the same page there, and to me, it's more just Congress feels like it needs to stand up and say, we're doing something. I mean, once again, I keep coming back to, and maybe all the total numbers aren't in yet, but that the Russians, and I took some heat on this for Facebook, but I will boldly go out there again and say $150,000 in ad revenue, and that's in ad buys, and that that doesn't pay for your coffee in one state, for a to get you on the ballot in a presidential election. So, look, should we do stuff to enforce the prohibitions on foreign meddling? Sure. Is this impose a too high a burden on these tech companies to do that? Maybe it does. So,
all right. Well, it is time for what we're reading when we step back from a crazy pace in the news cycle and talk about some, longer, more in-depth things that we're reading or sometimes listening to or watching. And, this week there was a big investigative piece came out that the Washington Post did in along with, I believe it was 60 Minutes, on the opioid epidemic and this law that was passed through a unanimous consent in both the House and the Senate that made it easier or made it harder for the DEA to stop suspicious drug shipments of opioids. It was a really fascinating read. I imagine a lot of listeners have read it. If you haven't, I would encourage you to, because regardless of what you think about the law, the information that they present about this amazing revolving door between the DEA and then lobbyists who go to work to try to lobby the DEA. I mean, this is a pretty common thing in government, but some of the statistics that they present are really, I think, would be eye-opening to a lot of people. I thought it was a really interesting article and, in fact, did lead to President Trump's nominee to run the DEA actually withdrawing because he was one of the people who was behind this legislation. And so a really interesting read, and I would recommend it. And of course, we'll have that article in the show notes. So,
Okay. My pick. Oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, so Jay, what's your pick? And you were just getting ready to tell me.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, two things, and one, I don't want to say it's my pick yet because I'm only like about a third of the way through it. But I'm finally getting around to reading Hillbilly Elegy, by J.D. Vance, and it's really so far I recommend it. It's not political in the sense of specific policy things, but it's sort of an on the ground look of what's happening, what has happened to the white working class in America, and it's good because it's also sort of a I don't want to say it glorifies or glamorizes, and it doesn't sort of assign away blame and say, well, it's all just globalization, or it's all the Chinese, or it's these policies. It also looks at personal choices that a lot of people make and don't make. But the companion thing to that I thought was interesting, that I will recommend, and people should read, is Kevin Williamson has a piece in National Review, and every once in a while Kevin Williamson just fires off these big pieces that deal a lot with class issues, and he had one a year or so ago that raised a lot of eyebrows both on the right and the left, where he sort of encouraged, listen, if you're in one of these towns, it's sort of, hey, look, drop the opioids and move and get a job. I mean, I'm paraphrasing.
No, I remember that one.
But it was sort of very much a tough love kind of message for white working class, or the underclass, the Trump voters. And this is sort of along those same lines, and he takes the concept of, in the Black community, there is what's referred to as acting white. And President Obama even talked about this, that, a Black child with a book is accused of acting white. And the idea that, somehow acting white is, again, leaning towards education and bourgeois values and so forth. And Kevin Williamson takes that and says, listen, the problem we've got now is that it's almost like the idea of this, the acting white means something different. He sort of said that, that I don't know. Again, I'm not phrasing this well, because I don't want to misstate what he's saying, but it's very much the piece that these values that once had been associated with rural, suburban America are now have fallen in disrepute among rural, suburban Americans.
All right. Well,
and
I was going to say, the fact that it's interesting you mentioned Hillbilly Elegy, because I actually read part of that a while ago, and it just didn't do much for me. I mean, this was a book, of course, that especially on the left, people were just going nuts about, and J.D. Vance's, he should run for office and all. And, I read it, and I just felt, I guess, it was a lot of stuff that I felt like I already knew. And I wondered, is maybe the strong reaction in some parts of the left because they're so out of touch with this part of America? It's just so it didn't, I read it, but it didn't really engage me a whole lot, because I was like, well, of course, yes, doesn't everyone know this? And I guess not. But I just recently, so I'm going to give people a bonus recommendation. Because of this, I read a book recently called American Rust. It's a novel by a guy named Philip Meyer, who he covers a lot of these same issues, but he does it in a far more compelling way. It's basically the story about two young kids in this decaying former steel town in rural Pennsylvania and so forth. And there's the same issues with drugs and the hollowing out of the middle class and crime and so forth. But I found it far more compelling and engaging. It covers a lot of the same ground. And so if, like me, you picked up Hillbilly Elegy and just thought, American Rust, you might want to check it out because it covers a lot of the same ground, and it's really compelling read. And so I'm going to make that a bonus recommendation for today.
Okay. And my last piece about the the Kevin Williamson is Mike. It speaks to it because I think you would get it too, because we both grew up in environments where I don't want to say there was also a pressure against education and doing something better with your life, because that wasn't necessarily the sense, but there were you growing up in Cleveland, me growing up in Youngstown, a sense of who needs that fancy college stuff? Why don't you just go get a real job? What Kevin Williamson addresses is kind of those pressures that exist and the choices that people make to them. I mean, and again, it is probably going to be some, again, strong medicine for a lot of folks, but to me, what he talks about is a part of conservatism that is hard to put into public policy because it's not really empirical. Looking at choices people make and attitudes that they have that are very difficult, if not impossible, to measure, and how to incentivize changes to that, which is also, again, difficult, if not impossible, to measure.
Yeah, that becomes extraordinarily tricky.
We'll put the link up and you make up your own mind.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that does it for today's episode. Thanks everyone for listening. We do hope you like what you heard and that you'll check out today's sponsor. That's Blue Bottle Coffee, where you can sign up for a free trial of fresh, delicious Blue Bottle Coffee at bluebottlecoffee.com/TPG. Listener support's a huge help to us. And if you want to help us out, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon link. If you want to support the show without spending anything, it would be great if you could share this episode with your friends and followers, or pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Also, leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes does help us out a lot. And if you want to get in touch with us, the question, comment, correction, whatever, you can email us at mail@politicsguys.com, or our Facebook page, where you can message us and we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. Executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.